The penthouse of the Lotte World Tower had never held so much lethal ambition. Evelyn Park pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the velvet curtains, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird as she watched the ceremony unfold below. Thousands of crystal droplets on the chandeliers caught the neon pulse of the Seoul skyline, casting electric pink and blue light across the faces of syndicate bosses, corrupt politicians, and high society vultures who had gathered to witness the union of the decade. The alliance. He should not have come. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to return to the cramped studio apartment where she had hidden for 6 months, waiting for a single phone call that never came. But Jun-suk had sent nothing. No burner phone messages, no cryptic letters, only the cold, hard silence of a man who had erased her. And so she had come to see the erasure for herself. The Mafia boss stood at the altar, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a custom-tailored charcoal tuxedo. Even from the back of the hall, Evelyn could see the sharp, predatory cut of his jaw and the dark hair swept back from a forehead that didn't show a hint of doubt. He held the stance of a man who owned the city, the kind of power that made hardened killers bow their heads in instinctive submission. For 6 months she had known the man behind the monster. The man who had whispered her name like a confession in the back of a darkened sedan. The man whose hands had trembled with a rare, terrifying tenderness when he touched her face. The man who had left his mark on her soul the night he swore she was the only empire he ever wanted to rule. When the war with the Vipers is won, he had promised, his breath warm and smelling of expensive scotch against her skin, I will come for you. I will give you my name, Evelyn. She looked down, her hand instinctively cupping the heavy, hidden curve of her stomach beneath the burgundy silk. The golden glow of the baby shoes in her clutch felt like a brand. Jun-suk had won his war, but he wasn't coming for her. He was standing before her sister, repeating the vows that were supposed to be hers. The crash of the floor-to-ceiling windows was a deafening roar that swallowed the gasps of the elite. Shards of glass rained down like jagged diamonds, slicing through the scent of white roses and expensive perfume. In an instant, the meticulously planned wedding of the century dissolved into a battlefield. Get down, the lead guard screamed, but Jun-suk was already moving. His eyes, usually as cold and unyielding as flint, were wide with a sudden, jagged terror. He hadn't been looking at his bride. He had been looking into the shadows, directly into the panicked eyes of the woman in the burgundy dress. Evelyn was frozen. She had spent 6 months preparing to be a ghost. But as a sniper's bullet whistled through the space where Jun-suk's head had been a second before, her body moved on instinct. She didn't run for the exit. She lurched forward, her arms wrapping protectively around the heavy, unmistakable curve of her stomach. Jun-suk reached her before his security team could even form a perimeter. He tackled her behind the heavy mahogany altar, his massive frame shielding her from the rain of glass. The impact was jarring, but his hands, the same hands that had once held her with such terrifying tenderness, were now gripping her shoulders with a bruising intensity. His gaze dropped. The charcoal tuxedo he wore was already dusted with glass, but his focus was entirely on the way her silk dress clung to the life growing inside her. For a heartbeat, the gunfire and the screaming of his new bride, Isabella, faded into a dull hum. Evelyn, he rasped, his voice a raw edge of disbelief and fury. What is this? It's nothing you need to worry about, she hissed, her voice trembling as she tried to push him away. You chose your empire, Jun-suk. Now let me go. But the Mafia boss she had once loved was gone, replaced by the predator who had clawed his way to the top of the Kangpa. He didn't ask for permission. As his beta Minho arrived with a tactical shield, Jun-suk hauled Evelyn to her feet. Help me. Isabella's voice rose above the din, her white lace gown stained with the soot of a smoke grenade. She reached out for her husband, the man who had just sworn his life to her. Jun-suk didn't even turn his head. His eyes were locked on Evelyn, his fingers threading through hers in a grip that was as much a rescue as it was a secondary arrest. Secure the perimeter. Jun-suk roared to his men, his voice vibrating through Evelyn's chest. Bring the armored SUV to the private lift. Now. What about the bride, sir? Minho asked, glancing toward a hysterical Isabella. Leave her with the secondary team, Jun-suk commanded, his face a mask of iron as he swept Evelyn into his arms, lifting her off the glass-strewn floor. This one comes with me. Evelyn fought him, her small fists thudding against his chest, but he only held her tighter, his heart beating a frantic, violent rhythm against her own. He wasn't just saving her from the assassins, he was locking her back into the cage he had once forced her out of. As the elevator doors hissed shut, cutting off the sights and sounds of the ruined wedding, Evelyn realized the secret she had kept for 6 months was no longer her own. The war for the Empire had just become a war for her blood. The private elevator ride had been a blur of sterile chrome and the suffocating scent of Jun-suk's expensive cologne. A scent that used to mean safety but now felt like a brand. When the doors finally hissed open, Evelyn found herself not in a dungeon, but in the sprawling expanse of his mountain villa. It was a masterpiece of glass and cold stone, perched high above the neon veins of Seoul, a place where the air was thin and the security was absolute. Jun-suk didn't let go of her arm until they were deep within the primary suite. He paced the length of the room, his tuxedo jacket discarded, the white sleeves of his shirt rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the Kaikangpa tiger snaking up his forearms. Outside, the rain lashed against the reinforced windows, but inside, the silence was more violent than the storm. "You've been gone for 212 days, Jun-suk said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his dark eyes tracking the protective way her hands stayed anchored to her stomach. "I sent my men to every corner of this peninsula. I thought you were dead, Evelyn. I thought the Vipers had taken you to spite me. You told me I was a distraction," Evelyn retorted, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain ironclad. "You told me our time meant nothing. Why would you look for something you threw away?" Jun-suk crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his presence looming over her, shadow-heavy and overwhelming. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was palpable. His gaze dropped to her midsection, his jaw tightening so hard she heard the bone click. "The child. Who is the father?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the power to change the trajectory of the Empire. Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the flicker of desperate hope buried beneath the obsidian layers of his pride. It would be so easy to tell him. To watch that hard mask shatter and be replaced by the man who used to hold her in the dark. But then she remembered Isabella in her white lace, standing at the altar to take the place that was promised to Evelyn. She remembered the coldness in his voice when he had discarded her like a used asset. "He's a good man," Evelyn lied, her heart breaking with every syllable. "A man who stayed when things got difficult. A man who doesn't build cages and call them homes." Jun-suk's expression didn't shift, but his eyes darkened until they were indistinguishable from the storm outside. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw with a ghost of the tenderness that used to undo her. "You're lying. Believe what you want," she whispered, stepping back from his touch. "But this child has no father in this house. You have your empire, Jun-suk. You have your bride. Let that be enough." "It will never be enough," he vowed, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You aren't leaving this villa until I have the truth. If you want a cage, Evelyn, I will give you one made of gold." The silence of the villa was a heavy shroud, one that pulled Evelyn back to the rainy night 6 months ago. She could still feel the phantom chill of his penthouse balcony, the way the wind had whipped her hair as Jun-suk stood before her, his face a mask of calculated indifference. "You were a distraction, Evelyn. A pleasant one, but the game has changed," he had said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised her forever. He hadn't looked at her then, staring instead at the city he was determined to conquer, while she stood there with the first flutter of new life in her womb, her world shattering into a million silent pieces. He had broken her heart not with a blow, but with a cold, surgical dismissal. A sharp rap on the door snapped the memory like brittle glass. The heavy oak swung open and Isabella swept in, her white silk wedding gown replaced by a tailored cream suit that screamed of borrowed authority. Her face was a study in practiced concern, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. "Evelyn. Oh, thank God you're safe," Isabella cried, rushing forward to clasp Evelyn's cold hands. "When Jun-suk took you, I thought the worst. I told him he was being reckless, dragging you into this mess after everything." Evelyn remained stiff, her pulse thrumming with a deep-seated distrust. "You should be at your reception, Isabella. Not worrying about a distraction like me." "You're my sister," Isabella whispered, leaning in as if to share a confidence. "I know he hurt you. I know why you ran. But you shouldn't have come back tonight. It's dangerous for you, especially in your condition. Isabella reached down to adjust the strap of her designer heel, a movement so fluid and mundane it almost went unnoticed. But as she bent, the hem of her trousers rode up just an inch. There, etched into the pale skin of her inner ankle, was a small, unmistakable mark. A coiled viper with its fangs bared. Evelyn's breath hitched, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. It was the mark of the Viper Syndicate, the very organization Jun-suk had been bleeding his empire dry to fight. Her sister wasn't just the new bride. She was the enemy's shadow inside the fortress. Isabella straightened, her smile sweet and venomous. Jun-suk thinks he's protecting you by keeping you here, but he's only made you a target. Don't worry though. I'll make sure everything is taken care of. Evelyn forced her expression to remain blank, though her heart was screaming. She looked at the door where Jun-suk's guards stood watch, realizing the golden cage was far more transparent than he knew. The man who had broken her heart to save his empire was sleeping with the very woman who intended to burn it down, and the only thing standing between the Vipers and the secret heir was a woman Jun-suk didn't trust and a sister who was a traitor. The door clicked shut behind Isabella, leaving the air heavy with the cloying scent of her expensive lilies. Evelyn stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the spot where her sister had stood. The image of the viper tattoo burned in her mind, a silent, venomous promise of betrayal. Every instinct she had honed while living in the shadows for 6 months screamed at her to run. But the villa was a fortress, and the man holding the keys was a king who no longer believed her. An hour later, a maid entered, silent and ghost-like, carrying a silver tray. On it sat a bowl of ginger congee and a glass of warm milk. Comfort food for a woman in her condition. The Lady Isabella insisted I bring this personally, the maid whispered, keeping her head low. She said you needed your strength. Evelyn stared at the steam rising from the bowl. In the past she would have found the gesture sweet. Now all she saw was the viper's coil. She waited until the maid left, then picked up the silver spoon. She didn't eat. Instead she remembered something Jun-suk had taught her during their secret nights in the city. Trust nothing that comes from a hand you haven't seen. She carefully poured a small amount of the milk into the soil of a potted orchid near the window. Within seconds the delicate white petals began to curl and brown, as if scorched by an invisible flame. A cold, metallic shiver raced down Evelyn's spine. Isabella wasn't just trying to move her out of the way. She was trying to erase the evidence of Jun-suk's bloodline before he could ever claim it. Panic flared, sharp and hot, but Evelyn forced it down. She couldn't call for the guards. They answered to the kingpin and his new queen. She couldn't call for Jun-suk. He was convinced her pregnancy was the result of a betrayal with another man. She walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked mountain path. The neon glow of Seoul felt a lifetime away. Her sister was a mole, a high-ranking infiltrator for the very syndicate that wanted Jun-suk's head on a spike. And Isabella knew that a secret heir was the only thing that could truly solidify Jun-suk's power and resolve. Evelyn sank onto the edge of the bed, her hand shielding her stomach. The golden cage had just become a death trap. She wasn't just a discarded lover anymore. She was the only person who knew the truth about the woman sleeping in the master's bed. If she stayed silent, they would both die. If she spoke, she would have to admit the child was his, tethering her baby to a world of violence forever. I won't let her take you, Evelyn whispered into the shadows, her eyes hardening with a newfound jagged determination. The time for hiding was over. To save the heir, she would have to destroy the sister. The following morning, the storm had retreated, leaving behind a heavy, mist-laden silence that clung to the mountain peaks. Evelyn had spent the night awake, clutching the dead orchid as a reminder of the venom circulating in her sister's veins. When the villa's private physician arrived for her scheduled prenatal checkup, Evelyn ushered him into the bathroom, the only space she felt was safe from the prying eyes of the security cameras. Dr. Han, an elderly man who had served the Kangpa for decades, worked with practiced discretion. He applied a cold gel to her stomach and pressed a portable Doppler against her skin. The room was small, tiled in marble, and filled with the static heavy sound of the machine searching for a rhythm. Then it appeared. A rapid, rhythmic thrumming filled the small space, the sound of a galloping horse, fierce and determined. It was the sound of a life that had no idea it was surrounded by monsters. The heavy door to the bedroom slammed open, and a moment later the bathroom door followed. Jun-suk stood in the threshold, his chest heaving as if he had run the entire length of the mountain. He had clearly ignored the guard's warnings, his face a thundercloud of suspicion and possessive rage. "I told you no one enters this room without my—" He stopped mid-sentence. The sound of the heartbeat echoed off the marble walls, filling the silence he had left behind. Jun-suk's gaze dropped to Evelyn, lying vulnerable on the vanity bench, and then to the small device held against her belly. The cold, obsidian mask he wore every day didn't just slip, it shattered. He took a step forward, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. The ruthless boss who had ordered the deaths of dozens was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just seen a ghost. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her stomach, trembling with a raw, visceral emotion Evelyn hadn't seen since the night he had cast her aside. The doctor, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quietly stepped back. Jun-suk's fingers finally made contact, his palm resting over the spot where the heartbeat pulsed strongest. In that touch, the lie Evelyn had told him, the lie about another man, a good man, dissolved into nothing. He knew. He could feel the echo of his own blood, the stubborn tenacity of his own soul, vibrating beneath her skin. This wasn't a distraction. It was his legacy. You said there was someone else," he whispered, his voice breaking in a way that made Evelyn's heart ache. He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with a mixture of agony and a terrifying newfound devotion. "But this is mine. This is us." Evelyn couldn't look away from the tears he refused to let fall. The Alpha had found his heir, and in that moment, the war for the Empire became secondary to the war he would now wage to keep them both alive. The cage was still there, but for the first time, Jun-suk wasn't the warden. He was the shield. The fragile peace of the morning shattered with a sudden eerie silence. The low-frequency hum of the villa's high-tech security system, a sound Evelyn had grown to associate with her captivity, simply stopped. In the hallway, the red status lights on the heavy oak doors blinked once and went dark. Jun-suk, who had been sitting at the edge of the bed with his hand still hovering near Evelyn's stomach, was on his feet in a heartbeat. His eyes sharpened, the vulnerability of the father replaced instantly by the lethal instincts of the Mafia boss. He reached for the encrypted radio at his belt, but only static answered him. "Isabella," he hissed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Before he could move, the sound of breaking glass erupted from the floor below, followed by the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. The Vipers hadn't just found them, they had been invited in. "Stay behind the reinforced wall," Jun-suk commanded, shoving a heavy dresser in front of the bathroom door where the doctor had retreated. He pulled a sleek black handgun from a hidden holster beneath the vanity, his gaze locking with Evelyn's for one desperate second. "Don't come out. No matter what you hear." He didn't wait for her to agree. He threw himself into the hallway just as a grenade detonated in the foyer, the shockwave rattling the very foundations of the mountain retreat. Evelyn huddled in the corner, her hands trembling as she clutched her stomach. Through the cracked door she watched the nightmare unfold. Jun-suk was a shadow in the smoke, moving with a brutal, terrifying grace as he took down the first wave of assassins. But there were too many. Isabella had provided the floor plans, the codes, and the timing. A second squad of Vipers swarmed from the balcony, pinning Jun-suk behind a marble pillar. "Check the bedroom," a gravelly voice roared. "Find the woman. The boss wants the bloodline ended tonight." Evelyn's blood ran cold. They weren't just here for Jun-suk. They were here for the heartbeat she had just heard. She looked at the heavy floorboards near the window. The spot Jun-suk had once mentioned held a last resort. With a strength born of pure, maternal terror, she pried up the concealed panel. Inside lay an array of tactical equipment and a submachine gun, cold and heavy in her hands. She looked at the door. She could run through the service vent and disappear into the mist, saving herself and the heir. Or she could step into the crossfire for the man who had cast her aside, the man who was currently bleeding out to buy her seconds of life. She remembered the way his hand had trembled against her skin just minutes ago. She remembered the viper mark on her sister's ankle. Evelyn didn't run for the vent. She checked the magazine of the weapon, her eyes hardening into the same flinty obsidian as Jun-suk's. If the Vipers wanted to end the bloodline, they would have to go through the woman who had spent 6 months surviving in the dark. She stepped out into the smoke, the ghost of the woman he once knew replaced by a mother protecting her empire. The smoke in the hallway was an acrid fog, tasting of cordite and betrayal. Evelyn stepped through the haze, the submachine gun heavy and cold in her grip, her eyes locked on the silhouette of the man who had once been her entire world. Jun-suk was pinned behind the jagged remains of a marble pillar, his shirt soaked crimson, his fire slowing as the Vipers closed the circle. He didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil jarring her shoulder as a hail of lead forced the assassins to dive for cover. For a heartbeat, she saw Jun-suk's head snap toward her, his eyes widening in a mixture of horror and awe. But the distraction was their undoing. A flashbang detonated at Evelyn's feet. The world turned into a searing white void. Her ears rang with a high-pitched scream that she realized was her own. Before she could recover, cold, gloved hands wrenched the weapon from her grasp and pinned her arms behind her back. "Don't kill her," a voice barked over the fading echoes of the explosion. "The boss wants the breeder alive. For now." Evelyn was dragged across the debris-strewn floor, her toes scraping against the shattered crystal of the chandeliers. She was shoved into the center of the foyer, where the rain was pouring in through the collapsed roof. Standing there, untouched and dry beneath a black umbrella held by a Viper soldier, was Isabella. The bride's cream suit was pristine, a sharp contrast to the blood and soot painting the room. She looked down at Evelyn with a chilling, clinical detachment. "You always were the sentimental one, Evelyn," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the ringing in Evelyn's ears. "Diving into a fire for a man who threw you to the wolves." "He did it to protect me," Evelyn rasped, coughing as blood from a shallow cut on her forehead dripped into her eye. "He pushed me away because of the hit your people put on me." Isabella let out a soft, melodic laugh that made Evelyn's skin crawl. She leaned down, the scent of her lilies masking the smell of death. "Oh sister, Jun-suk didn't push you away because of a hit. There was no hit, not until I fabricated the threat. I sent those assassins 6 months ago. I leaked the fake intel to his beta. I made sure he believed that the only way to keep you breathing was to break your heart and send you into the night." Evelyn felt the world tilt. The breakup, the months of agonizing loneliness, the belief that she was a distraction. It had all been a choreographed nightmare conducted by her own flesh and blood. "It was a perfect setup," Isabella whispered, her eyes dancing with malice. "He gave you up to save you, and in doing so he cleared the path for me to take his throne. And now, thanks to that little heartbeat inside you, I have the final piece of leverage I need to make him burn it all down himself." As the Vipers dragged Evelyn toward the waiting shadows of the mountain path, she looked back one last time. Jun-suk was being forced to his knees, his gaze fixed on her with a raw, agonizing clarity. He had lost everything to save her, only to realize he had been handed the knife that cut them both. The shipyard was a skeletal graveyard of rusted shipping containers and salt-cracked concrete, swallowed by the sulphurous yellow fog of the Incheon docks. Evelyn sat bound to a metal chair inside an open warehouse, the freezing sea wind whipping her hair across her face. Across from her, the Viper boss, a man whose face was a map of jagged scars, tapped a heavy signet ring against a satellite phone. "He's coming," the boss rasped, his eyes gleaming with a sick anticipation. "I told him the price. The Kangpa's northern territories, the supply routes, and his own head on a plate. All for the girl and the little heartbeat." Evelyn's hand was tied, but she pressed her palm as close to her stomach as the ropes allowed. "He won't give you anything," she whispered, though her heart felt like it was breaking. "He's a kingpin. He doesn't surrender." "He isn't just a kingpin anymore," Isabella's voice drifted from the shadows. She stepped into the light, twirling a poisoned blade between her fingers, her bridal makeup now a smeared, ghoulish mask. "He's a father. I saw his face when they dragged you away, Evelyn. He's already broken." Suddenly the air began to vibrate. It wasn't the thunder of the storm, but a low, rhythmic growling that seemed to rise from the very earth. On the horizon, a line of light appeared, not neon but the harsh, blinding white of high-beam headlights. Dozens of black SUVs roared onto the pier, moving in a perfect, lethal formation known in the underworld as the Black Parade. The Kangpa had arrived. Thousands of soldiers in dark suits spilled out before the vehicles had even fully stopped, a sea of obsidian moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. At the center of the phalanx, the crowd parted. Jun-suk stepped forward. He had traded his torn tuxedo for a black tactical coat, his face a mask of such absolute frozen rage that even the Viper soldiers stepped back. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to burn the world down to get her back. The Viper boss grabbed the phone. "Stop right there, Kong. One more step and I open her up." Jun-suk didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He raised a hand and the sound of 1,000 safeties clicking off echoed through the warehouse like the cocking of a single massive hammer. "You think you have leverage?" Jun-suk's voice boomed, amplified by the warehouse walls, sounding like the judgment of a god. "But you've made a fatal mistake. You took my heir. You took my home." He looked directly at Evelyn and for a split second the predator vanished, replaced by the man who had whispered her name in the dark. He raised his chin, his eyes promising a bloodbath that would turn the harbor red. "I'm not here to trade," he roared, the black parade surging forward behind him. "I'm here for my blood." The warehouse erupted into a symphony of violence. The black parade surged forward like a tidal wave of obsidian, crashing into the Viper front lines. Muzzle flashes illuminated the gloom in staccato bursts, turning the shipyard into a flickering nightmare of silver and shadow. Jun-suk moved with a terrifying primal grace. He was no longer the man in the tailored tuxedo. He was the dragon of the Kangpa unleashed. He cut through the enemy ranks, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency, but his eyes never left the metal chair where Evelyn remained bound. Evelyn didn't wait to be rescued. As the Viper boss turned to fire at Jun-suk, she threw her weight to the side, toppling the chair and using the jagged edge of a rusted shipping crate to saw through her restraints. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time the ropes snapped, but she was free. She didn't run for the exit. She scrambled toward the boss's discarded tactical tablet, her fingers flying over the glass. She knew the villa's encrypted frequencies. She knew the codes Isabella had used to bypass the security. "The cranes," she screamed over the roar of gunfire. "They've rigged the overheads to drop." Jun-suk dove behind a concrete pylon just as a massive shipping container crushed the spot where he had stood a second before. He looked up, catching her eye through the smoke, a grim flash of recognition passing between them. He provided the sheer, brutal force that kept the Vipers at bay, while Evelyn acted as his eyes, calling out sniper positions and flanking maneuvers hidden by the fog. As the Kangpa overran the warehouse, Isabella tried to slip away toward a waiting speedboat. But Jun-suk was faster. He intercepted her at the edge of the pier, his hand clamping around her throat with the weight of 1,000 betrayals. "Isabella Kim," a new voice boomed. The elders of the Mafia Council emerged from the shadows of the black SUVs, their faces etched in stony disapproval. They had been patched into the warehouse's audio feed by Evelyn, listening in real time as Isabella's voice, recorded by the tablet's internal mic, boasted about the fabricated hit and her Viper alliance. "You brought a parasite into our house," the eldest counselor spat, looking at the Viper mark on her ankle. "You traded the king's blood for a seat that was never yours." Isabella's face drained of color, her bridal grace finally dissolving into a pathetic, shaking terror. She looked to Jun-suk, her lips trembling as she tried to form a plea, but she found no mercy in the eyes of the man she had tried to ruin. Jun-suk didn't say a word. He simply shoved her toward the council's enforcers and turned his back. He walked to Evelyn, his breathing heavy, his black coat stained with the cost of the night. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers trembling as they brushed her cheek, before sliding down to rest, warm and protective, against the heir who had survived the storm. The aftermath of the docks was not a celebration but a reckoning. Within 48 hours the marriage between Kang Jun-suk and Isabella Kim was not merely ended. It was erased from the annals of the Kangpa. The Mafia Council, moved by the evidence of the Viper infiltration and the presence of a true heir, sanctioned the annulment with a cold, blood-stained efficiency. Isabella was stripped of the Kim name and delivered to the Council's deepest shadows, leaving a void that the city expected to be filled with more war. Instead they found a coronation. The grand hall of the Lotte Tower, still bearing the faint scars of the sniper's bullets, was filled once more. This time there were no white roses or strategic alliances. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the silent, heavy respect of 3,000 soldiers. Evelyn stood at the center of the dais, no longer a ghost in the shadows but a woman bathed in light. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her hand resting openly on the curve of her stomach. Beside her, Jun-suk stood in a black suit that fit him like armor. He did not look at the council or the bosses. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time in his life, his eyes held no shadow. 6 months ago, I lied to the woman I loved to save her life. Jun-suk's voice boomed, carrying to every corner of the room without the need for a microphone. I chose my empire over my heart, and in doing so I nearly lost them both. Today I do not ask for your approval. I simply present your future. He took Evelyn's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and raised them high. Evelyn Park is my mate, my equal, and the mother of the next king of the Kangpa. This bloodline is secured. Any threat to her is a threat to the foundation of this city. The roar that followed was deafening, a primal acknowledgement of power and lineage. Months later, the violence of the world felt like a distant echo. In the penthouse villa, a room had been transformed into a nursery. It was a space of soft grays and warm creams, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling, neon-lit expanse of Seoul. Jun-suk walked to the marble mantel, his movements quiet so as not to wake Evelyn, who was resting in the chair by the window. In his hands he held the tiny pair of golden baby shoes that Evelyn had clutched on the night of the wedding. He placed them carefully in the center of the mantel, right beneath a portrait of the two of them. He looked out at the city below, the neon pinks, the electric blues, the shimmering silver threads of the rain. For the first time he didn't see a battlefield to be conquered or a territory to be defended. He saw a home. He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to Evelyn's forehead before resting his hand one last time on her stomach, feeling the strong, steady kick of his son. The secret was out, the war was won, and the dragon had finally found his peace.